welcome, and thank you for joining this talk on critical AI and labor under the auspices of OBVIA, CRIMT, and the International Network on Digital Labor. So my name is Kai-Sin Hung, and I'll be the moderator and also discussant for this talk. I'm a PhD candidate at HSM Montreal, researching the globalized nature of work and workers in AI production. So in this session, we aim to continue an ongoing conversation about the social sustainability of AI by looking at the labor side of the equation in AI production, with a particular focus on the countless data workers who are doing this data work, also known as data preparation, data wrangling, that can take up to 80% of a data scientist's working time. However, this data work and the workers doing this are often highly undervalued, and this work is often digitally outsourced overseas. For example, very quickly, in the development of ImageNet database, one of the early benchmark data sets for object recognition, the sixth data scientists led by Li Feifei heavily relied on the 50,000 data workers from 169 countries who were paid 2 cents per task to do the billions of data preparation tasks to make that data set possible. So these work practices continue to this very day, and we should continue to ask hard questions about the uneven work realities and the social and economic value of the sector, and also the meaning and the social responsibility of the many humans and humans in the loop subroutines. And has in fact that these are exploitative work practices, making up the digitally intermediated human supply chain and so many of our data-centric technologies we have in our pockets, at home, at work, and also in our institutions. So first, we have Mila Guo, who are open to look at, to give us an inquiry into a power-aware perspective, into how to engage machine learning data sets. Then we have Kelly, who are explaining the data value network supporting labor platforms. Then Maxime and Clement will examine the workers in the global value chain of AI production between France and Madagascar. Then lastly, Julian will look into the reproductive labor and what this means on families and communities. So first, let's go to Mila.
So thank you very much. Thanks to everyone and to Kai for organizing and for inviting me to talk today about bias and power. So I will go really quick to introduce this talk and what I do. So I am a sociologist and a computer scientist, if that's a possible combination at all. I am the head of the Department Data, Algorithmic Systems and Ethics at the Weizenbaum Institute in Berlin. And I'm also a community-based researcher at their institute, working with communities of data workers, especially data labelers in the Global South, or in the so-called Global South. So this is the paper that I will be presenting today, but I will also add ingredients and examples from other research done by me or co-authored by me. This is a paper co-authored with Julian Posada, who will be closing this panel, and also with Tianling Yang. You can use the QR code to find an open access version of the paper. So in the paper, we posed the question, why talk about bias when we mean power? And we used that question to discuss the limitations of using bias as an umbrella term to describe everything that is wrong with AI, and how. And we also argue, or what we argue is how this framing of bias, of problems as bias, distract us from addressing the question of power in socio-technical systems such as machine learning. So based on my research with data workers, I will bring in the talk examples of how the bias framing has shaped research in data in the context of machine learning, data work, and also data documentation. So let's start with machine learning data, because understanding what data is and where data comes from is key for understanding the behavior of machine learning systems. In AI research, we often talk about black box algorithms, or there is a lot of talk about black box algorithms, but little is said about the fact that data sets are black boxes as well, and that we don't know much about what is in data sets or how they are constructed. And the common understanding that computer scientists have of data often gets in the way to understanding and even interrogating data sets. Because in the hard sciences in general, but specifically in computer science, we often learn, or is often taught, that data is a given, and that it is some sort of truth that is indisputable and absolute. That data is something that is just laying around, waiting for us to collect it, and not that data is something that is actually created by humans. So we use expressions in computer science such as raw data, you must have heard this one, or ground truth data. As researchers, and I'm assuming there are many researchers among the people in the room, as researchers, we write things in our papers such as, based on the data, the results show, as if the fact that our findings or our results are based on the data would be a synonym for quality, for factual truth, as if the fact that they are based on data would be a guarantee for those results to hold some sort of truth. In fact, data bias has been defined as a systematic distortion in the data that can be measured by contrasting a working data sample with other samples taken from other contexts. And this is not something I'm just making up. This is a textbook definition. I will not say whose definition this is, because this is just very widespread, and I'm not here to point fingers at anyone. It's just that this is very widespread, and this is the definition that AI research dealing with bias generally use. And this textbook definition, as I said, comes from the same idea of data, that there is an absolute truth value encoded in data, that data holds truth, and that bias is just a distortion from that truth value. So there is data that equals truth, and anything that is outside of that truth value is bias. And therefore, we can identify bias by identifying that distortion, and we can mitigate and even prevent bias, because, yeah, we just need to point at that distortion from the truth value that we think that data encodes. However, in the social sciences in general, but specifically in STS and in data and critical data studies, there is another type of understanding of data. There are many definitions that stem from that field of inquiry, but my favorite is this one: data is the product of unequal social relations. This is from Data Feminism. And what this means is that data is never a given or an absolute truth. Data is actually someone's truth, one truth over others possible. And in that sense, data is always biased. And here is where the power question that I was, is the title of that paper, the power question, where the power question becomes more visible, because data encodes the assumptions of those in charge of deciding what information to consider data, where to collect that data, how to classify it, or specifically in terms of machine learning, how to label that data. As researchers, we know this. We know that in every research project, someone will decide the research questions, the methods to use, the sample, and that those decisions will decisively impact the data that we will get, and also the knowledge, the truth that we will produce with our research. And we also know that the person making those important decisions is often the one with more power. This is often the PI in a project and hardly ever the research assistant. I probably will never be able to explain this better or more eloquently than MC Hammer on this tweet, where he says, when you measure, include the measurer. But what I mean is, what I already said, that data is a product of unequal social relations, and as such, data is always biased. And data work is one of those arenas where the unequal social relations that produce data become more visible. Data work is the labor involved in the collection, curation, classification, labeling, and verification of data that is used to train and validate machine learning systems. Kai already mentioned this in his introduction. Very often, machine learning companies and research organizations outsource data work through platforms and also through BPOs, which is short for business process outsourcing companies. because for requesters, outsourcing these tasks is considerably cheaper and faster than having them done in-house. Now, why is this cheaper? Well, that's because when outsourced, data work is conducted under very precarious conditions where most workers are paid only a few cents per task and don't count with the protection or the benefits related to more traditional employment relationships. And it's also cheaper because these BPOs and these platforms often target very poor regions of the world and or specifically or especially underserved populations. Now, in bias research, data workers have broadly been regarded as a problem to be solved, as bias-carrying hazards whose subjectivities are detrimental to the data and therefore need to be tamed. As you can see now on these paper titles that you see on the slide, this is real research being published in the past 5 years. For this kind of research, the goal is to mitigate workers by constraining and standardizing their judgments. This is the main rationale behind this type of research. Now, there is another way of looking at this problem, at looking at the problem of bias or assumptions encoded in data sets. And this is what my research is about, and also what this panel, what this event is about. And that is the attempt to bring back the human, the social, and the political economical into discussion by situating these workers and their labor in larger institutional and structural arrangements. Through that lens, we have shown in the papers that I have co-authored, we have shown that industrial settings don't allow much room for workers' preconceptions or biases to broadly affect data, because these subjectivities are persistently, are persistently constrained through our hierarchical structures. So data is produced according to the instructions provided by clients, and workers actually don't have much opportunity to introduce biases to data as is commonly believed. We have studied this with Julian, and this is part of our new and open access paper, the Data Production Dispositive, where we showed that data work instructions and interfaces are completely narrow and leave no room for interpretation. Also, on top of all this, the geographical and social context in which these workers are located have a key effect in the perpetuation of asymmetrical relationships and on the top-down imposition of meaning in data or through the workers on the data and on the data sets. As I said before, BPOs and platforms target vulnerable populations and impoverished regions of the world. The context of poverty and vulnerability of these workers make them dependent on requesters and thus very much obedient to the instructions. So they have no possibility to escape this kind of work because they don't have other alternatives. And as such, they are not very much prone to contradict instructions or to contradict requesters. So instead of seeking the wisdom of crowds, as crowd work is advertised, there is what is done is imposing ways of interpreting and classifying data. And these forms are generally, these forms of interpretation are generally guided by economic imperatives and technical possibilities. So the rationale is usually what is the cheapest way of creating this data set and or what kind of data and what kind of labels fit my model. So how to create data that fits my model and how to do this fast and cheap. And this imposition or this way of this data, this way of doing things is deeply naturalized because it seems common sense for data to be produced according to the requirements of paying clients, no matter how harmful or arbitrary such classifications and such interpretations might be. Okay, but there is still assumptions encoded in data sets that affect data systems and outcomes. Now, we know that these assumptions are probably not the assumption of the poor data labeler in Kenya. We just discussed this. It is about the assumptions and the worldviews of paying clients that still get encoded in the data sets. So how do we make those worldviews explicit and transparent? And here is where data documentation plays a role. So in the past 5 years, researchers have started to pay attention to data sets, and they have argued that documentation could be a way to make those assumptions that we were just mentioning explicit and to make also data sets, machine learning data sets more transparent. However, we have noticed that there are still some challenges in terms of making power in data set explicit. And I argue that these problems are rooted in the fact that these documentation frameworks are based on the goals of transparency and bias prevention, which are, as I already mentioned, they are quite limiting goals in themselves. One question that is repeated, or one important part or ingredient that is repeated in all those documentation frameworks that already exist, is the question about the data set composition. So the documentation template would prompt you to list the labeling taxonomies, the classes, the categories, and especially special attention is paid to the presence of labels for race and gender classification. The problem is that there is no reflection besides the mere act of listing. And just listing doesn't really speak to the political work that those classifications do. And in fact, documentation or documenting this type of classification might even serve to reify the existence of those classifications, because once those become official through documentation, they become a thing that actually exists and is valid. So they don't get questioned anymore. So the question persists: how do we make documentation truly useful and not just a performative act, something that we just check on a list? Okay, now I've documented, I'm ethical, my model is ethical. The problem is that these frameworks aim at transparency, as I said before, which is not a bad thing in itself, but transparency, just like bias, has its limits. So in terms of transparency, it would be enough that we disclose the ingredients of a data set. It would be enough that we just say, okay, I've used these categories for racial classification. But any attempt to make power encoded in data sets, or make power in general, visible and contestable, needs to go beyond transparency and aim at reflexivity. Transparency, because transparency is just about disclosing, as I said before, it's just about listing the ingredients of a data set. But reflexivity is about understanding, it's about questioning, it's about interrogating. And also reflexivity has a collective dimension that transparency doesn't have. Also, transparency is generally very much post-mortem. So transparency in general happens once things are already done. In terms of data set documentation, it happens when the data set already exists. And so we document and we say, okay, we are transparent about what this data set entails. Instead, reflexivity is about the process, and it happens as the process unfolds. And thinking of the process brings us to the main challenge for documentation. And that is the fact that data sets are not fixed entities, but they evolve and change over time. Data production is iterative, and in this sense, documentation can only provide a snapshot of the data set at a given moment. So if we document the data set, we just retrieve the state of the data set at a given moment, but that data set probably will keep on evolving and changing and being iterated. So documentation is typically designed for linear communication and also in terms of communication from the dataset producer to the dataset user. And this is again rooted in the goal of bias mitigation, and rooted in the assumption that the more specific and narrow the communication, the less the chances for bias. So I propose a shift of perspective from documenting data sets to documenting data production. This is something that we have published in our latest paper, also with Juliana among the other amazing co-authors. We argue that that documentation should accompany and reflect the processes of data production, not just the final product that is the data set. Documentation can and should work as a communication medium that enables feedback loops and transports the voices of workers back to the requesters. So summarizing, the bias framing is limiting. To study up data, we need to talk about power. To talk about power means to talk about labor. Labor is a key dimension of AI ethics. And I mean, if the focus of AI ethics is mitigating bias, then those approaches where I show you the papers, those approaches to constrain data workers' subjectivities to make sense, do make sense in a way. But if we look beyond the bias framing, it becomes quite evident that improving labor conditions in AI supply chains should be a key dimension in the AI ethics discourse and in research. This is important because otherwise research is doomed to produce simplistic results that, for instance, end up allocating the responsibility for biased data with vulnerable workers exclusively. So we need to study up, we need to shift the research focus and give place to different research questions. And different research questions require different methods and the collaboration between different disciplines and expertise. And with that, I say thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's give the floor to Kelly to continue our conversation to explore the value chain aspects of this. Thank you, Mila.
Just give a brief introduction to my work and my background. I've just finished a nearly 3-year postdoc with the Oxford Internet Institute, working with a project called Fair Work. I come from an economic geography background, hence the interest in value chains of data production and what I'm going to talk about today, which is the uneven geographies of cloud work. The Fair Work project is interested in mapping and documenting working conditions across the platform economy. So that includes location-based platform labor like ride-hail and delivery work, but also remote platform labor, which we call cloud work, others refer to as crowd work or micro work. So our action research project probes these working conditions, and out of that, we've recently published a paper on the value chains of cloud production in the unpaid labor that characterizes the cloud work platform model. And this paper was published alongside wonderful colleagues, Hannah Johnston, who's at York University, Matthew Cole, Fabian Ferrari, Funda Ustek-Spilder, and Mark Graham, all at the Oxford Internet Institute. So just a little bit more background to what I mean when I use cloud work. So we use this term to refer to remote labor that's mediated by digital labor platforms. These are companies who connect workers with clients through a digital interface, who exert some control over and derive some value from the labor process. And a lot of workers on cloud work platforms are engaged in AI production or in what we might call the data value chain, providing data for the data sets that go into training AI and machine learning. But in this paper, we focus more broadly. So we include these microtaskers, AI data workers, but also online freelancers. Where you might have a higher level of skill and qualification in the work that they're performing, whose tasks might be a bit longer in duration, like design, consultancy, etc. But recent estimates, which are now probably quite out of date, but are the best we have at the moment, put the registered workforce on cloud work platforms at 163 million. And while cloud work platforms enroll workers in nearly all countries, the majority of cloud work takes place in the so-called global south, with clients disproportionately based in the global north. So in 2020, nearly 35% of the labor supply on major English language cloud work platforms was in India alone, followed by Bangladesh and Pakistan, while nearly 40% of the demand emanated from the United States, followed by the United Kingdom. But despite these unequal territorial relations, we haven't seen a lot of research yet from economic geography that probes the impact of these cloud work platforms on uneven historical geographies. So our paper tries to address this gap, and in doing so, we draw on global value chains literature, as well as Marxist political economy literature. We use a survey of 699 workers on 14 platforms, And our key takeaway in this paper is that unpaid labor is characteristic of the cloud work model. So cloud workers perform a high level of unpaid labor, but also that this unpaid labor is unevenly distributed between workers in the global north and the global south, with workers in the global south performing more unpaid labor as a proportion of their total labor time. So unpaid labor emerges as a key engine of geographical value extraction in cloud work value chains. So to just elaborate a little bit, I won't go into too much detail here, but on how we're using global value chains theory here. In a previous paper, we had made the case for researchers of digital labor platforms to engage with GVC literature and vice versa. And that's because we identify digital labor platforms, including cloud work platforms, as sitting at the center of cross-border relations of production, accumulation of data commodities. And from this central position, they coordinate the production process as lead firms to optimize value accumulation. And our paper goes into detail on the overlapping characteristics between global value chains and cloud work platforms. But for this presentation, I just want to point to the importance of understanding how cloud work platforms lead these protracted production chains and how they exert power over these chains, which result in geographically uneven outcomes. Cloud work platforms as lead firms do display characteristics which are less associated with lead firms and global value chains, though. For instance, we know that the profit they pursue can take different forms with different imperatives, like the speculative value of data assets. And another complicating factor for GVC approaches to cloud platforms is the fluid, shifting, and ethereal nature of interactor relations and the murkiness of inputs and outputs. On these platforms, workers might produce dozens of data commodities in a day, each for a different client in an unknown location for an unknown end use. And these data commodities may continue to be valorized in unknown products into the future. Hundreds or thousands of workers in different locations might contribute to completing one data task for one client in a very short space of time. And so it might be possible, but it's very difficult to identify the value chain, the exact value chain linkages. Who has contributed to a specific project? Where are they located? We proposed an example illustration of a data value chain here, but mapping the entirety of the input-output structure, the geographical distribution, and cloud work networks is extremely complex. And so that's why we use this term digital value network, which we see as being made up of very many data value chains. And this is a way to try to capture this complexity. And since their emergence, since the kind of rise of global value chains in various industries, advantageous participation in value chains has been seen as a development strategy. And similarly, embracing the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution through participation in data value chains has been touted as a solution for fast-tracking development and addressing unemployment in low and middle income countries. But research on GVCs and conventional sectors and emerging research in the digital economy have revealed how value chains can and have been very effective at extracting value from what we could call the economic periphery towards the centers of wealth and power. So global value chains approaches call for ongoing attentiveness to the uneven development outcomes of globalized economic activities. And that's what we really try to apply to cloud work platform relations and configurations. I'm going to skip over this slide. This is just to show some of the governance features that we identify in cloud work value chains, but I think that it's getting a little bit too into the detail of our theoretical framework, and I'd like to move on to our empirical results, but I'd be happy to share this if anyone's interested in exploring further. Just a brief word on methodology. As I said, we, as part of our Fair Work rating action research, we undertook a survey of 699 workers on 14 platforms in 74 countries. This includes micro work and freelancing platforms. Because it is almost impossible to get a representative sample of cloud workers, not least because cloud work platforms don't make information easily available about the size and distribution of their workforce, we use purposive sampling to recruit a diverse pool of respondents, accounting for different work experiences, where they live, and we tried to get an equal number of respondents from across 6 global regions. So we kind of present a bit of a typology of the way that unpaid labor manifests in cloud work in our paper. So I'm organizing the findings along this typology. And the first type of unpaid labor that we see is non-payment for completed work. So this was reported by 33% of workers who said that they had completed work on a platform and not been paid for it. And there are a few reasons for this. Actually, there was a illustration from Mila in one of your slides, that quote that said, if your work doesn't meet the quality standard, you will not be paid. So this is quite a common reason for workers not being paid for work they have completed. It can be rejected on delivery by the client, by the platform, or potentially by some kind of algorithmic management system. Clients often have carte blanche under platform rules to reject work delivered by workers if they deem that it's not of a certain quality. Some platforms also operate what are called contest models, where a large pool of workers will be able or invited to respond to a brief. They'll complete work in response to this brief, and only one or only a small number of those workers will be the winners who are able to receive compensation. There are other instances, there are other kind of mechanisms where workers might not be paid for completed work. This includes clients just failing to sign off on their work, arbitrary time limits, workers being timed out of the task that they're completing. And where workers are able, through platform infrastructures, to appeal rejections of their work when they occur, there's a high opportunity cost for doing so, especially for micro workers whose tasks might take a matter of seconds or minutes. The time that it would take to appeal a rejection of that work is obviously longer than it would take to just move on to the next task. We had a worker in Brazil who responded to our survey and said, as much as there is a risk of not being paid, there's also a risk of being paid. So the model that's set up by these platforms is that as a worker, you're disincentivized from challenging non-payment instances, and as a client, you're structurally incentivized to engage in work rejection and non-payment. The second form of unpaid labor stems from the time workers spend responding to extra client demands. And this is time that goes above and beyond what is agreed or understood at the start of contracts. Often it stems from changes in client demands during the duration of the contract. So 71% of freelancers and 36% of micro workers, translators, and transcribers had done more than the agreed amount of work for a client. And this happens in order to maintain reputational metrics like ratings, which workers are materially dependent on for their access to future work. We find that there's little monitoring of excessive client demands on workers' time. And bad reviews or ratings can mean losing access to the platform altogether, losing access to your livelihood. So these amount to coercive systems of platform enclosure where clients are favored in disputes, ratings aren't portable to a different platform, and this leaves workers with little choice or agency to push back against clients requesting extra time, unpaid labor. There's also this other type of unpaid labor, which we've called aspirational labor, which is labor in order to find work in the future. So we know that platforms deliberately maintain a labor buffer or a large oversupply of workers. This enables clients to have their requests filled very quickly because at any given time, there's thousands of workers sitting at their computers refreshing their screen, hoping to get a job when it comes available. So overall, we asked workers how much of your time is unpaid. How much of the time you spend on the platform is unpaid? And we found that 34% across the board is unpaid. This includes searching, bidding and applying for jobs, demonstrating qualifications, usually through tests that are prescribed by the platforms, building profiles, and also identifying and reporting scammers. And we argue that far from being normal unpaid labor that a freelancer would be expected to absorb, whether or not they're working on a cloud work platform, this labor is actually coerced and extracted through the platform model. And it allows platforms to externalize cost and risk to workers, to commodify labor, to maintain task completion timeframes, and to provide value to clients. Our other important finding is that this unpaid labor is distributed unevenly geographically. So we already know that the majority of cloud work takes place in the global south with clients based in the global north. So this already suggests that digital value networks of cloud work may perpetuate value extraction along, if you like, colonial dimensions. But unpaid labor itself is also unevenly geographically distributed. We found that location in the global south is a strong predictor of higher levels of unpaid labor. So workers in the global south perform more unpaid labor than their counterparts in the global north, even on the same platforms, even when you account for the amount of time that those workers are spending on the platforms overall. And we attribute this to geographic discrimination, where workers in the global south have poorer conditions and are treated more poorly by workers overall. So in conclusion, unpaid labor is an integral part of capitalist relations. It's the extraction of surplus value from workers' work. It's a systemic feature of cloud work and a key logic of the governance of digital value networks. And the spatial, digital, and monopsony power of cloud work platforms, that's the slide I skipped over, but the governance capabilities of cloud work platforms leads to especially high levels of unpaid labor. This unpaid labor is unevenly distributed territorially. And despite some claims about the potential of digital labor platforms to create more equitable global economic participation, our analysis shows that the ability of value chains which are predicated on intangible commodities whose production is not tied to a specific location can still perpetuate and amplify geographically uneven outcomes. Thank you so much. I will figure out how to stop sharing. Right.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kelly. Fascinating work, and thanks for sharing your latest research. And now we are going to pass it on to Clement and Maxime. Oh, and then just to note, Kelly is also joining us from South Africa as well. So back to Clement and.
Yes, thank you very much. Maxime and I are both PhD students, and we are working on a project called Deeplab for digital labor platform. And our research is focused on data work, global value chains in French-speaking countries. Sorry. So basically, we are working on data workers who are producing data for French AI companies or even French companies in general. And spoiler alert, those workers are situated in Madagascar, in Africa. Just a few words to introduce this presentation, which is based on a paper we are currently writing with Maxime and also with Antonio Casilli. Yeah, just some introducing words about our literature framework. So the idea of this paper was to bring together three fields of studies. So there is this literature in STS focusing on AI, especially this paper by Beckman and Boker. And in this paper, they basically didn't do any reference to microwork studies. But they invite researchers to document human choices made in the work process surrounding AI. So basically, this is the idea we followed for this paper. And there is this literature on microwork, for instance, the work from Mary Gray, which is focused on workers and on working conditions, but there is not much research on other stakeholders of the value chains, for instance, AI firms or final clients of AI services. So this is also an idea that we wanted to follow for this paper. And we also tried to use a framework in organization studies about the tendency of companies to outsource an increasing part of their activities. So this is something that was well documented. You have this paper by Beatrice Appey in the 19th who describe how those new modes of work organization led to mass layoffs in the 80s, which is linked to an increased externalization of tasks. And the idea for those companies was to gain greater flexibility and leanness to achieve greater competitiveness. But during this process, they are taking advantage of precarious workers. So basically, the research question is, very large, but the idea is to analyze who are really producing AI in French-speaking countries, and how data workers are interacting with AI, with startup employees in France. And we also tried to investigate every phase of AI system development, and we try to analyze all of this human work that is involved during this process. And the idea is that at every part of the production chain, the model is kind of touched by human hands. To do, yeah, and the goal to deal with those issues, we try to we tried we did some interviews with our startup employees with questions on how they create the models, on how they deploy it, and how are they making their AI systems evolved. And another important thing about this research is that we're not studying AI as a technology, but more AI as something that is now part of more and more products and services. And so we only considered for this paper commercial companies and AI applications. And to do so, we draw 2 case studies. So Maxime will go more deeper into it later, but we have 2 case studies. So the first one is about a French startup who is trying to automate theft detection through video surveillance and an algorithm that is supposed to detect gestures associated with thefts. And the second case study is about a company that is trying to create a computer vision model in canteen to automatically detect what is on plates. And Maxime.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so what are the insights from this field work? Can you pass to the next slide, please, Clément? Yeah, thank you. Well, one of our main results is that AI startups consider data annotation as an integral part of the service production chain. So here, the contractors produce a constantly renewed, essential part of the product, so the dataset. And for this reason, the model, and to allow the model to actually function, they need actually high quality evolutive datasets, which mean, of course, professional and trained annotators and good coordination tool to ensure that information is passed along all of the production chain. And this basically means that there need to exist strong ties between annotators and the employees at the French startups so that information can be passed on. There need to be frequent discussion occurring between them. And here we have the CEO of a French AI company saying that annotators are basically people who are almost employees, even if statutory they aren't. So this quite nicely illustrates the way they envision annotators. They are basically employees of the startups. And it also means that every lab will image and undergo several checks to ensure dataset quality. So at both the startup in France and at the annotation company in Madagascar. And it also means that employees at startup companies, some of them, so their whole job is to train and monitor data annotators. Next slide, please. Thank you. So that's an example of the coordination flow between automatic canteen and their magazine contractor. So here we have an annotator saying that there are tags already defined by the clients. They will tell us if the meat look like this and it's a bavette or pork chops. They are basic tag, but we noticed that we couldn't identify what we saw in some images through the tags. So we sent those images back, asking what it was, and the client told us what it was, and that we were allowed to create the corresponding tags on the platform. And he asked us to notify him before creating any tag. So this illustrates basically the cyclical process of the French startup send images to the Malaysian contractor who identifies things on the images and goes back to the French startup when they can't really classify the items on the images. Next slide, please. All right, so what do we mean by AI as a coordination tool? Well, here you have 3 extracts from interviews, which showcase that for both case study, the algorithm primary use is to allow the lengthening, both spatially and chronologically, of the interaction chain mobilized in the production process. So the first extract is by the intendant of a supermarket, in which the AI product AI view is deployed, and is saying that I get an alert in 1 minute when I'm first floor and in 30 seconds when I'm ground floor of the shop. So this is quite real-time interaction between annotators and the store employees. So how does this work? Well, the algorithm only serves at a very specific point of the production chain, which is to sort videos to send to Malagasy annotators who watch the selected videos in near real time and report theft to the intendant or security personnel. So the service here is not really an algorithm that detects automatically theft, but it's basically security services provided to the supermarket. So for automatic canteen, the customers are ultimately the one being involved in feedback loops to fine-tune the interaction process. So here we have a solution architect at the French AI startup saying that automatic customers interact with the system. If they disagree with what the algorithm say, they can correct the output. So what can we generalize from this? Well, we have two main takeaways from this fieldwork, which we would be very happy to discuss later, but as already touched on, those are primarily the use of AI is to lengthen service production labor chain, allowing the service industry to externalize labor in the same way that the manufacturing industry have been doing for quite some time now. And that AI intervene in the cyclical service production process, so every actor involved gives feedback, which serve to enrich the algorithm or fine-tune the distributed production chain. So this is a figure on your screen right now, summarizing the main findings, and especially the feedback loops and externalization chain, which is taken from a paper that we're in the process of publishing with Clément. So I'm not gonna spend too long on this because we only have 15 minutes, but you have three main group of actors intervening in the co-negotiation of concepts necessary for the algorithm to function. And our main goal was to show that every actor that is involved in the production chain is actually involved at some point in the connective work that is defining useful categories so the algorithm can actually act on its surrounding. So the algorithm is both at the center and just a support of a distributed service production chain. So here, this is a production scheme of the automated canteen terminal. And so the service would be here customer checkout. And traditionally, customer checkout services has only involved two kind of people, which are the cashier and the people standardizing and putting prices on the meals. And now that the AI is involved in the process, these services involve all of the people that you see on the screen right now. And I'm gonna give back the mic to Clément.
Okay, so just as a conclusion, so our idea was to investigate this production chain, and what we saw is that AI production process is very dynamic. So you need at every point of the value chain people who are doing this classification work, but also this problematization work to build the algorithm. And as a result, we argue that in fact, AI is only connective work that is dedicated to align the model with the real world. And that's precisely what consumers, workers from Madagascar, but also people within the startups are doing, because the main goal of those models is to deliver service, not only just to be automated. And as a result, what we consider that AI is in fact cascading hidden externalization chains, which is, by the way, inscribed in the lengthening of externalization chains, which is allowed by ICTs. This is the example of AI view, where you have an algorithm, but you have workers in Madagascar who are doing the work instead of the algorithm. And that's why precisely if you want to lift the veil on the algorithmic black box, you need to study all of this data production process, because and as Mila said in the presentation, in the first presentation, data are truth. So that's why you need to study this production process. Thank you very much, and we'll look forward for your questions.
Great, fantastic, and it definitely put into question the distinction and the interplay between human intelligence and machine intelligence as well. So next, let's go to Julian to look at the embedded reproduction and the costs on communities and families who are dependent on this type of work. Julian?
So thank you, Kai, for having me here, for everyone to listen to this talk. So I'm going to present a paper that I published earlier this year titled Embedded Reproduction in Platform Datawork. By the way, I'm Julian Posada from Yale University. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone. It's Thanksgiving Day here in the States. So what do I mean by embedded reproduction? It's actually a dialogue that I wanted to propose between these two frameworks of literature, one on embeddedness, or the reliance of social actors on their environment, both social and natural, and the reproduction of society, especially from a Marxian perspective, the reproduction of the workforce. So what I wanted to discuss in this paper is that there is a relationship between this reliance on institutions and other actors such as employers, and how they affect the way society is reproduced. And the focus of this paper is on platform data work, which I'm going to also explain in a bit. I'm just going to put my timer so I don't go over time. There you go. So what do I mean by platform data work? Actually, by the way, this is the paper. I'm going to put the link at the end on a QR code for those who are interested in reading more about it. But first, what do we mean about data work? And this is something that I discussed a lot with Mila for our previous work. Is that we found a lot of terms in the literature about work that is done on platforms, but there was no specific term for that type of work that was exclusively for the production of data for machine learning. We had terms like micro work that we found did not acknowledge that many of the tasks are actually not micro, but actually take a lot of time. For example, semantic implementation, which is a task that requires almost an hour per task to identify objects in an image. For example, for surviving cars, you have crowd work as well. But Mila, for example, her work was on BPO, so people inside, and actually smaller teams. So it's not actually the distributed crowd that we see in platforms. And then we had also cloud work, which is a term that I know Fair Work uses, as Kelly said, that I love, but also that one is more broad because it includes freelancers. So there's not a term exclusively for data work, for machine learning that we wanted to use. And finally, ghost work from Grant Suri, which actually the authors argue it's a critique term. It is not actually something to describe the future of how this work should be. And then in the end, we ended up settling on this term called data work that has been used in the past in computing for precisely all this type of work, and actually was previously used mainly for medical settings, for doctors and nurses who produce, annotate, and verify outputs in the AI they use in clinical settings. So that's why we mean by data work. And this is in the slide here, I have a very simplified version of a machine learning model where you have data input it into a model to produce an output, and the three types of work that are involved in it, three types of data work, which is the generation of that data, its annotation, and after the output, its process, the verification of the accuracy of that output. So that is what we define as data work. So the main idea of this talk is that the platform intermediation that happens around data work at least these workers, but also their local communities to carry on more social and economic risks associated with online freelancing. My fieldwork is focused on Venezuela. I did a survey of web traffic I analyzed the data from web traffic from a few, 93 actually, Datawork platforms, so platforms specialized on the production of datasets for artificial intelligence. And I found that outside of the United States, most of this traffic for worker websites comes from Venezuela, which is the focus of my fieldwork. So why Venezuela? Why is Venezuela? I mean, I'll go back. You see all the other usual suspects of business process outsourcing: India, Philippines. There are players rising like Brazil, Russia, and Mexico, and so on. But Venezuela is the one that topples them off, and it's because of the current situation in the country that has been happening for at least since 2014. Venezuela is a country's inflation rates produced by their over-reliance on oil, and when the prices of oil dropped, coupled with local corruption, political instability, authoritarianism, industrial sector is not diversified, but also sanctions from foreign powers, mainly the United States. So all of this create an economy, a precarious economy for people where they had to rely on external sources of income and to find work elsewhere uninformally as well. So a bit of the situation of the country. This is the results from a recent study by the University Andrés Bello in Venezuela. It shows that it argues, I mean, it shows that it has as I said, the highest inflation rates in the world. Its GDP has increased by 80% since the crisis started. The minimum wage remains lower than $20 per month, and as low as only $1 per month when I started doing my fieldwork in 2020. By 2021, 51% of the workforce was unemployed, and from those employed, 51% were freelancers, up from 30%. So there's more reliance of people on freelance work. And finally, that poverty has increased from 32% in 2013 to 94% in 2021. And extreme poverty has increased from 9%, around 9% to 76.6%. So all of this to say that there is a very difficult situation in the country, and that more people are looking for other sources of revenue, especially in the formal economy, especially as freelancers. And this is why online platforms, but especially those doing data production, have become common sources of income for many Venezuelans. But not only the crisis explains this, also the infrastructure of the country that was built by the policies of the government. This is an image of a computer called Canaima, which is a computer built in Venezuela and funded by the government, distributed to children. That today many workers use it. And other types of computers are also used that are built in the country from local funds, government funds. Also, even though electricity and the internet and other public services are not reliable, like they come and go. For example, you can lose your electricity for a few hours per day. There is still subsidized by the government. So there is an infrastructure there, and the government is still present there, even though there is a crisis happening in the country. So what does it mean, this crisis for people? It means that there is a shortage of goods, including food and medicine, that public services are free, like electricity, but as I mentioned, unreliable. There is limited access to public healthcare. And during COVID, many schools closed because of the pandemic. So there was a lot of children and people stuck at home, many lost their jobs. So all of this creates what I call the perfect recipe for labor outsourcing. So I say, this is one part of these embeddedness, is this reliance on our social environment. We rely on our institutions, we rely on our employers. And in terms of institutional support or government support, what we found is that the infrastructure is there, but the government has retroceded because of the crisis, because it doesn't have the means anymore to provide welfare to the people. And then the second part of these institutions that provide the support to people are the employers. And in this case, platforms, as many know, consider workers only as users. They can be terminated any time, no explanation and no recourse. They're paid even less than a cent per task because of the inflation. Usually wages are around $15 per month in these platforms. And many report social isolation and health issues. So not only the government has retroceded in terms of support to people, but also the employers, there is a commodification of labor happening, meaning that then the employee has to bear more of these risks, socioeconomic risks associated with their economic activity. This commodification shifts then all these risks to the worker, all this, let's say, precarity, dependency, and lack of stability, economic stability, it all shifts, and it's all these costs are borne by the worker. So this first conclusion is that then there is more labor commodification and less institutional support in here. But what happens, and this is something that has been demonstrated in other instances in labor embeddedness, but also in the gig economy, is that then people have to rely more on their personal networks. If your employer and your government is not there to support you, then you have to look for other means of support, and your local networks become fundamental in this task. So this is how this commodification of labor and this economic uncertainty affects social reproduction then, by you having to rely more on those networks. So what I asked myself was, what types of social support then people seek out in those networks? So how workers supported when their labor is commodified? And the first one and the most common is the family. First, a lot of people were collaborating with each other with tasks. I found that people, for example, share one computer and one account, but we're working constantly throughout the day. Someone would tell me, I work in the morning, and when I cook, my children work for me, for the family. And then after we're done eating for lunch, I go back to the computer and they can go back study. And the computer is on all day and constantly. Another more historically present in terms of social reproduction is, of course, the reliance on domestic and care labor, which is still, I did a survey to 600 workers distributed on the platform Fullfish, and about the types of domestic duties that they do. And by analyzing this data, I found that, like historically has been the case, there's been more and more women doing these types of tasks, even though there is more or less parity in terms of gender for the workers. And more qualitatively, when I was talking to workers, I found that actually many of them, especially male workers, had to rely on these to have time for the tasks. Someone would tell me, I have many children and my wife and I work both for the platform. So it's my mother-in-law who takes care of the children all day while we work for the platform. And finally, there is a third part of the types of support received by family members, and is the financial support. In the sense that, for example, there's a lot of remittances from people from abroad sending money to relatives in Venezuela, but also more financial support for things like housing. Very few workers, very few, less than 1%, would live alone. They'd always rely on family houses owned by their family members. And also they would rely on other types of infrastructure owned by the family, for example, for transportation, or for even computers passed on from children who received them during school time. Remember the canaimas that I mentioned, then pass them to their parents for work. So there's a lot of financial support as well happening around families. The second circle, let's say, of social circle that provides support to workers is the colleagues themselves. Colleagues have organized, and workers have organized online, first to produce spaces to voice concern and criticism outside of the sphere of the platform, because the internal forums of platforms are usually heavily policed, so you cannot voice your criticisms. And this is something that we mentioned in that paper that Mila talked about, data production Dispositive, about the surveillance and the managerial strategies of clients to impose their views on workers. So what happens, what I found is workers find other spaces online. Some of them, and this is the second point here, are actually trusted networks, smaller groups on WhatsApp or Telegram, To make part of those groups, you have to pay a fee, usually $1 per month. You have to provide your ID. You have to generate that trust. The members of these groups usually range around 60 to maximum over 100. And know each other very well, and the administrators of these groups know who these people are, their IDs, they know their addresses, and so on, because they need these groups to generate trust in an environment where there is a lot of scams, for example, happening. One example that I found very compelling is an administrator of these groups told me that someone sold 10 accounts to someone else in the group, and the buyer received the accounts but never paid. But because they knew the address, the local address of this person, they went there and asked what happened. Turns out this person lost access to their electricity, so they could not connect to the internet and the computer and could not send the accounts. Because there is a pool of money, as I mentioned, there is a fee, a monthly fee of around $1 per month. The administrators paid off the person until the buyer could connect to the internet again and reimburse the community for this. So there's a type of insurance. All this to say that then these trusted networks exist and are also local, not only online, they're like hybrid. They also work for the transactions, the financial transactions, because what happens is that you're paid in online currency, digital currency, often through PayPal or Uphold, and then you have to transform that into local currency, bolivars. For that, there is many brokers that have emerged in the market that buy digital currency and sell local currency. But because there's a lot of scamming happening, these groups also have their own trusted broker that they promote within the group as well. And finally, the last part of these, how these online groups support each other, is through instruction and the translation of guides, because all instructions are in English. Many workers, I would say more than the majority, the majority of workers, they don't speak English. So what many of these groups do is that they translate the tasks for the most popular, the instructions for the most popular tasks, and provide guides as well about how to answer this. And this is also something that we discuss in the paper, the Reproduction Dispositive, that I co-author with Mila. And finally, the last part is the neighbors, the more like broader communities, local communities of workers, because there is no, there's a retrocession or less, the government is less present because of the crisis. Many communities have lost access to basic services. One example is garbage disposal. So many people in these neighborhoods have organized to, for example, in terms of garbage, just to pay a truck every month to pick up their garbage from the local landfill that they have in the neighborhood. For example, they have, when they lose access to water, they have a well that someone every week in this community that I interviewed, every week someone comes in and opens, like turns on the pump to pump water from the sea, and then distributes the water on wells to the community. Those who do not, for example, have access to these commons or shared resources, they for example, someone who has to burn their own garbage in their backyard because there's no truck. The truck is too expensive to pay on your own, so you have to get rid of your garbage on your own. That generates pollution and also pests in your environment, and that affects negatively you as a worker against social reproduction. It affects you negatively as a worker for your own job, and because you bear the risks of your own economic activity, it's a negative cycle then. So neighbors, local communities are essential then to coordinate access to services and also to share existing resources. If someone loses access to the internet or to the electricity, you can easily go to your neighbor and work from there in many of these communities. It is a communal sense of support that allow many people to be able to work. And so I leave you with these three main conclusions. The first one is that platforms are not, in a pure economic sense, only intermediaries between clients or like one party or the other, not only between the producers of the workers and the developers of machine learning. There is a lot of communities behind the worker who are also affected and bear the risks of these socioeconomic activities. It's not only transactions among individuals, there is a whole community behind the workers. The second one is that commodification service inequality. There is no freedom and flexibility. There is a cost for it, and this cost is borne not only by the workers themselves, but also by their communities, their social environment. And finally, that shared resources are essential to social reproduction. This is more like a broad conclusion. Social reproduction, historically, as a field of inquiry, has focused mainly on the households. But actually the communities around the households are also important, especially when you do research on, again, the so-called global south, but I recently learned this term majority world that I like better. So people in the majority world rely more on these local communities that are for to social reproduction. So these are my three conclusions. This is again the link to the paper and content information if anyone has any questions, and look forward to the Q&A happening very soon. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Julian. Fascinating work, and to see the ripple effects of these interactions. And I think throughout the different presentations that we have, it really talks to the not just the social technical systems of AI, but also the global political economy and the uneven geographies of how AI operates, and the many effects and the workers who are being impacted. So for now, I would like to see if people wish to ask a question, please do use the Q&A box to pose your question. And as the moderator, I will begin with the first question, and then after at 11 or so, where we end the official session, people are welcome to join in a more informal discussion for those, including the panelists who are able to join for about half an hour more. And yeah, so now let's talk about what do we do. And I have kind of shared this question on, can you share one policy or one kind of more practical way or approach or solution that these inequalities can be addressed? And then I want to turn this back to the panelists. So I don't know who want to go first. Clement, Kelly, Mila, Maxime. Oh, and then we can go to another question by Blair. But let's begin with that, and then feel free to unmute yourself as well. Mila, since you began the conversation about power, would you want to kick us off?
I mean, yeah, I can try. It's a hard question, and it's always a discussion of whether we are here to provide solutions for things that we have not created, right? So sometimes I feel it's unfair that we social scientists are asked for solutions when we kind of point at the problem. And my answer is always, well, I'm not saying this is a bad question. I'm saying this is a question that comes very often, especially from the people who are responsible for these systems. When I present in front of computer scientists, I often get this, like, okay, you've pointed at the problem, then now tell me the solution. And my answer is always, well, you've created these systems, and come up with the solution yourself. But that said, I think that there are many things that we could be doing depending on the perspective that we take on this. So, for example, we can do, of course, a lot for these workers. We can start by doing the kind of work that Kelly presented today, and the kind of work that Fair Work is doing, trying to make these inequalities visible, make visible the kind of wages that these workers are perceiving, and also, we on the other side as researchers, we can try to find out, because we as researchers, I'm not saying we specifically, but researchers use this kind of service a lot. And in our universities, I'm sure everybody knows a colleague who has worked with crowd workers or through platforms. So one thing that we could be doing is, as researchers, to start interrogating not only what we pay as service, as requesters of these services, but also what these platforms pay to their workers. I think that would be a good step to start with. Because in general, we think that what we pay goes directly to worker, and that's not the case. So that's the first step. But then if we look at this on the other side, and that's what I try to do with my research, is to try to bring these two worlds together, the world of labor conditions and the study of labor conditions, but also how those labor conditions affect the data sets that are created. And I think that that we need to talk more about that. We need to talk more about the fact that the way that we treat these workers affect the quality of the data that we are creating, and therefore the systems that are produced or trained on that data. I think I've said this in my presentation. I think documentation is a way of doing this, but documentation shouldn't be something that we do just to feel good about ourselves. It needs to move beyond the performative act of saying, oh yeah, now we are ethical, now we have documented. It needs to do something with the information that we register in the documents. So yeah, I think that's a start. I don't know if that's a clear, I think that's more of a kickstart for the discussion rather than a solution.
Yeah, I just want to add something regarding what we presented with Maxime, and maybe regarding commercial companies. So, for instance, in France, we have something called the duty of vigilance in the French law, and basically this basically ordering companies are supposed to conduct social audits to detect working conditions problems, as well as problems with human rights, and that is something that is not for now applicable to digital labor, but I think this is a good solution, because what we observed even in Madagascar, but also in Venezuela and in other countries where workers are doing data work, is that there is obviously bad working conditions, but it is possible for ordering companies to just be more aware of how bad those working conditions are. And this is something that exists in the French law. And this is also something that is discussed at the European Union level. So I think this is a very concrete solution on this regarding policy and working conditions.
Yes. I think there's also the German example, the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, which is a similar intervention, which kind of compels German companies to report on human rights in their supply chains, which could be applied to hardware AI production. But I think that we also need to find ways to build worker structural power, because there can't be sustainable solutions to this commodification of labor and, increasingly precarious working conditions without, worker collective power being part of that equation, without workers being able to assert their agency to bargain for better conditions. But that is incredibly difficult to achieve in these geographically distributed networks, because, for one thing, it's impossible to know which jurisdiction it applies. If there are labor protections in the workers, in the place where the worker works, because they're classified as an independent contractor, they're usually excluded from those labor protections. And because the relations of between employer and worker and client and platform are so kind of complex and murky, it's very difficult to know where to start. Also, workers face enormous challenges in communicating with each other and building networks of solidarity, especially when they're scattered all over the world, and their only way of contacting each other is through the platform's own interface. So these are some of the barriers to finding solutions to the working conditions in data production networks. But I think it's just important to say that while we as users of platforms may be able to make more ethical choices ultimately the real structural change has to come from worker power and from responsive regulation.
I wanted to add that I've been working on expanding this quantitative research that I did about this, where the workers are according to web traffic analysis. And when I stopped a year ago, when I stopped collecting the data a year ago, what I showed was that there was a decrease in Venezuela actually happening, and there was an increasing traffic from Kenya, Brazil, and other places. And the reason I wanted to keep digging more into this is because what I fear that this looks at is, because before Venezuela was the Philippines, and it just looks like platforms are just moving from one place to the other, like a predator, just like extracting from one place until it's depleted, and then goes to the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And this also has implications in terms of the forms of organizing that happen among workers. They want to better your long-term economic conditions, because there's this thought of, oh, this is just a crisis, this is momentary, and for the blacks too, this is just momentary, we just move on. So what I don't have the solution for this to address this, but the question is, what are the implications in terms of global policy and law and so on for these practices of just moving from one place to the other to deplete resources, not only like environmental resources, but like social resources like labor, and the labor of the communities as well, and from one place to the other in this predatorial way. How do we stop this cycle? So this is like an ongoing question that I'm not a policymaker, even though I love discussing policy and so on. But this is a question that I have as a researcher from what I'm observing from the data. Like, how do you? The internet is enabling these practices that are not sustainable, as I argued during my talk. How do we stop these cycles from repeating themselves? Is the question.
Thank you very much, everyone. And if possible, can we entertain one more question before we go to the informal? And for the organizers in the background, I don't know if it's possible to bring those who wish to remain online for the last half an hour that's informal, that won't be recorded, to also bring make people attendees so we can interact more freely if that's possible. And yeah, so before let's say go with one last question, if I may, posed by an anonymous attendee, where they're saying, what are the obligations of international companies? And I think this would be more for Clement and Maxime, of outsourcing contracts. And I think these are some of the continuation of the flexibility and the employment relations that have been going on since the 80s as well. So more on the obligations, and I think some of you have talked about some of the mandatory reportings in some jurisdictions. Any last thoughts before we end the recording and transition into the informal session? Thanks.
Do you want me to go first, Clement? Yeah, perfect. Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, the duty of vigilance that Clement was talking about is actually extraterritorial, so it doesn't really depend on the local labor law. And even if we take in account the local labor law, we found in some cases workers that under their local labor law were considered we're doing illegal work. Basically, they had illegal working condition, because the Malagasy labor law is basically based on the French one. It's like a remnant of colonization, and a lot of social protection and social provisions that are integrated in French law are find their way back into the Malagasy labor law. So not all of them, obviously, but the work contract is is a constraint in Madagascar. I mean, you can't really do what you want with workers once you sign them a work contract, and so on and so on. And you have an obligation to sign an employment contract with employees if the conditions are reunited, like if you employ them full time, if you have control over them, if you define the working hours and so on and so on, you have to sign them a formal work contract. And this comes with a minimum wage, and this comes with social protections. So just basically respecting labor law is a good first step, I think, and ensuring that your contractor actually respects local labor law is a good first step. And I don't know if you want to add something, Colonel.
Yeah. Maybe regarding the duty of vigilance law, the problem is that it's only compelling company to conduct risks mapping and basically to implement mechanism of alerts to prevent those risks regarding working conditions and human rights. And one problem is that we found some big French companies who are outsourcing the development of their AI systems to startup, who said to those companies that they are doing fully automated systems, but in fact you have Malagasy workers behind the system. And in this case, the main company is not even aware of the fact that they have subcontractor in Madagascar. So. And this is a matter of visibility, and this is something that Mila already mentioned, and this is also something that is also in the AI Act discussed in the European Union, because companies who are developing high-risk systems have to declare how they build their training data sets and stuff like this. So this is also something regarding the regulation that could be used to make workers more visible, which is something very important.
Great. Thank you very much for the last few interventions. So I would like to formally close this session. And of course, happy Thanksgiving, Julian, as well, to the Americans who are celebrating Thanksgiving. And with that, I would like to thank the panelists with their great intervention. And thank you to OBVIA, Valentina, Isabel, and also colleagues for supporting us technically, and also to CRIMT and also the International Network on Digital Labor. So with that, we'll formally stop the recording, and then if people wish to remain for informal session, please feel free. I have let you guys have the option to turn on your camera and also use the mic. So now I'm going to formally close it and stop the recording.